I've always wanted to ask you, just from more theory and just less current affairs, just theory-based point of view. I know you're quite pessimistic about the whole concept of really democratic and economic peace theory, and that there's an inevitability you see in great power competition. But many have argued that, I guess, the more integrated economically powers are, and the more conjoined the citizens are in terms of achieving some mutual understandings, but also in recognizing that the other isn't really the other, there's also more to it, that heightens the probability of peace and lowers the incentive for war. Do you feel vindicated by the recent 2 years of events, or do you feel that it's always really been the case that your thesis is affirmed by what's going on in the world?
Well, there's two theories at play here that stand in opposition to my theory, my realist theory. Yeah. One is economic interdependence theory, and the other is democratic peace theory. In no way has democratic peace theory been put to the test, because China is not a democracy. Mm-hmm. If China were a vibrant democracy, the United States is a vibrant democracy, and you had this intense security competition, then you might be able to say that this contradicts what we would expect from democratic peace theory. Although defenders of democratic peace theory would say you need a war to disprove the theory. But anyway, the theory, there's no possible test of this theory because, again, China is not a democracy. Economic interdependence theory is a different matter. I have a talk that I've given probably about 125, 135 times on why China cannot rise peacefully. It's my basic realist story. I've given that talk many times in China as well as in the United States. The argument that is most frequently used against me, the argument as to why I'm going to be proved wrong, is economic interdependence theory. Many people believe that given all of the economic intercourse between not only the United States and China, but China and its neighbors, there's no way you can have a war in East Asia involving China and the United States or China and Japan, because the economic consequences would be catastrophic. So this is an argument that economic prosperity guarantees peace. I hear that argument all the time. I would make 2 points. One is I think it's wrong. And I think the fact that you've had this intense security competition and many people are worried about war speaks volumes about that theory. The other point I would make to you is we have a great deal of decoupling that's taking place now. If anything, the economic connections between the two sides are weakening. They're lessening. So I think in the future, you're going to have less economic interdependence than you have now. But I think even if the levels of economic interdependence did not change, right, basic realist logic would trump economic interdependence theory.
That's very fair. And I guess I just want to add on to that discussion, really, because I see two theses or two variants of the thesis. One variant is to say it's a conditional thesis. So if there exists beyond a certain threshold, a certain level of economic interdependence, then war is unlikely, which is what you would characterize, I guess, as the sort of economically grounded liberal theory in that sense. But the other, which is a broader interpretation of current events, not really a theory, but it's more like an observation, is we currently are just proceeding or moving further and further away from that critical threshold of economic interdependence. And a corollary of that is maybe the decoupling occurred either because we were not at that threshold yet where economic interdependence becomes self-replicating, or that where indeed we're deviating from that hypothesis, it's not a fault of the theory, but merely the fact that we haven't reached or satisfied the conditions required for that theory to hold. So it's not that trade doesn't bring about peace, but that we just haven't gotten enough trade just yet. So I guess that's my pushback against your rejoinder.
Well, you might be right, but we need the evidence to test that theory. I mean, the argument would be that you need a lot more economic intercourse before you reach the threshold where peace is pretty much guaranteed and security competition is ameliorated to the point where it's not significant. I don't believe that, but it could be the case that that is correct. I would just note to you, Brian, that I think the main reason to think that I may be wrong and that the security competition will not be that intense and you certainly will not have war, the argument would rely on nuclear weapons. Okay. And the argument you want to make here is that China and the United States and some of China's neighbors like India are armed with nuclear weapons. And you just cannot have a war between the United States and China because of the threat of nuclear escalation and the threat that will all be vaporized, right? So it's not economic interdependence that really matters. It's nuclear deterrence. And this, by the way, is why we didn't have a hot war between the United States and the Soviet Union, and the same thing would apply to China. I have counters to that argument, but what I'm saying to you is I think that's the most powerful argument against me.
I think there's a modification of the argument that might also improve its strength. I'm just going to test it out here. So effectively, it's the idea that I agree with you that nuclear deterrence is a potent force, but also that despite the existence of nuclear weapons, we still see countries engaging in sort of skirmishes and altercations, right, in a military sense right now, whether it be China and its neighbors in SCS, the South China Seas, or the Taiwan Straits, indeed, CF the 1990s. But the reason why there hasn't been an escalation, but also that the military action has still occurred, albeit in a very limited and contained fashion, is because such action is propelled primarily by the need to legitimize and self-authenticate and self-legitimize governance. And I think that, to me, seems a more plausible interpretation of how China's been reacting to what it terms US provocation, or US to Chinese provocation, that ultimately you have to be accountable, whether it be through democratic means or through oligarchic factionalism, to your own citizenry to some extent. And that, I think, is also why, given increasingly we've got a wider berth of tools that countries could deploy in waging warfare. So you've got economic warfare, even though I don't think it's a type of warfare. You've also got cyber warfare and perhaps indeed one day bio warfare. Maybe the argument or rejoinder against your thesis is, yes, there will be war, but it won't be necessarily hot war or even a cold war en masse, but instead a deeply fragmented and chaotic, locally speaking, a series of mini skirmishes, meso skirmishes, and then just uneasy major or sort of macroscopic tolerance of one another, kind of reminiscent to what you said in your 2019 article about the thin layer that holds between the two spheres of influence. So I guess that's my pushback against your thesis there.
Well, I think there are two problems with what you say. First of all, I think that you greatly underestimate the importance of nationalism inside of China. The Chinese elites have played the nationalism card in very important ways in recent years. And nationalism in China is built around the concept of the century of national humiliation. Yeah. And the Chinese are remarkably sensitive about the foreign policy behavior of both Japan and the United States. Yeah. And I believe that if you had a major crisis, major military crisis over Taiwan or over the South China Sea, the Chinese governing elites would have great difficulty backing down because of nationalism. Exactly. I think domestic politics inside of China would leave the governing elites in China, whether it's Xi Jinping or someone else, in something of a straitjacket. So you do not want to underestimate the extent to which nationalism in China limits the flexibility, right, of the leadership in a crisis. Second point I'd make to you is that if you look at the possible scenarios in which you get a war, you get real fighting between the United States and China, it's in rather remote locations like the South China Sea or the East China Sea, or even over Taiwan, which is an island, you know, out in the Pacific Ocean. It's not a fight over Beijing or over Shanghai, right? And I'm not saying that it's likely you're going to get a war between the United States and China over the South China Sea or Taiwan, but it's easy to imagine that happening, right? You can think of plausible scenarios where the United States and China start shooting over the South China Sea. As I often say to people, during the Cold War, the principal point of military competition between the two sides was Central Europe, or what we used to call the Central Front.
Yeah.
It was almost impossible to imagine a war on the Central Front because you had two massive armies on either side of the inter-German border, armed to the teeth with thousands of nuclear weapons. If those armies crashed into each other in Germany, we probably would have all gotten vaporized. So war became unthinkable almost. War is not unthinkable in the South China Sea or over Taiwan or in the East China Sea. So the point I'm making to you is when you factor in nationalism and you factor in the actual scenarios where you might get shooting, there's a lot of cause for pessimism here. And there are good reasons to think that we may not just have intense security competition, we may actually have a war. It will be a limited war. We're not going to have World War III. Nuclear weapons rule that out. But we could have a limited war. And there is serious threat for nuclear escalation. Now, I really hope that doesn't prove to be the case. I hope that, smarter minds prevail on both sides. But we live in dangerous times.